Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you to PSSI for having me over. Mirjin is actually really great. I'm very, very happy to be here, despite my many multiple complicated identities. Look, Jirji just said very clearly it's not going to be positive. At the same time, I don't want to discourage you about NATO. And the people in the think tanks tend to have a very cynical, negative view of what's going on in NATO. But at the same time, when you kind of take a holistic approach to things, you do see that there are some reasons to hope. So, and Jirji, I will get to why we have some reasons to hope. I promise. And so when Peter contacted me, he asked me to talk about NATO towards a new transatlantic bargain question, with a question mark at the end, which I think is also very important. And so I'm just going to try to give you a sense of the dynamics that animate the political discussions in between the US and Europe within NATO, just to try to give you a sense of, basically where NATO is going between the Wales summit that happened last September and the Warsaw summit that will take place in 2016, in July 2016. So just try to give you a quick picture of where I see this going, where I see fault lines in the transatlantic relationship or in transatlantic security cooperation. And just basically, just a quick few things to look out for that you will see in the papers, that you will see in academic journals, that you will see on websites, when the big NATO pictures. So basically, quickly, I mean, the class is called A New Bargain, and when you hear new bargain, immediately the first question that you ask yourself is, why do we need a new bargain? And the other question that you ask yourself is, why did the old bargain not work? I mean, what was this previous bargain and why did it need to be changed? And you kind of take, this transatlantic approach to look at it whether this bargain worked. You could argue that from a European side, the transatlantic bargain was, fine. You've heard all these recommendations from the Americans about the Europeans being free riders, about the Europeans taking advantage of the American security guarantees. But the fact is that today, and this is a very simple fact that even the Americans recognized, the US is no longer in a position politically, militarily, to uphold this bargain. So in a way, you've had fundamental changes on the American side that have created the conditions for a new bargain. And in this, in this situation, for me, the onus of the new bargain that we're going towards rests squarely on the European side. And I will try to give you a few arguments as to why I think this is the case. So it's absolutely necessary to look at what the drivers are for this new bargain on the European side. And also, in a way, you also need to understand how the dual crisis that is affecting European neighborhoods, so the crisis in the East and the crisis in the South, you have to kind of look at these crises to see how it's affecting the evolution or the setting up of this new bargain. Whether it's just a temporary picture, whether these are crises that are going to disappear within 5 years, or whether these are crises that will be structuring for the alliance. And I submit to you humbly that these crises are actually structuring for the alliance. And so this is like one part of the introduction. The second part is that we're talking about a transatlantic bargain. I also want to submit to you, also very humbly, that you may want to start thinking about a European bargain. This is extremely important because the drivers of this new transatlantic relationship have their roots in Europe. It's undeniable. The crises are happening in Europe. The crises are happening in the European neighborhoods, and that's just for the hard security part. You have the more difficult part, which is harder to resolve, such as Greece. I mean, obviously you've followed the developments, where you are currently sitting in a region that has a very hard time to get its political act together on designing coherent immigration and integration policies faced with the crisis that they're facing. So these are, elements of the European bargain that I also want you to keep thinking about when we talk about a transatlantic bargain. And this is, I mean, just the reasons that I underlined. These European challenges are, for me, one of the structuring reasons why it's extremely hard to move the center of gravity of NATO, of the Transatlantic Alliance, from the US to Europe, just because the Europeans have internal problems that kind of limit their political will to act. And also, I mean, in relation with this, also limits their capabilities to act. And by capabilities, I mean hard capabilities. I'm talking about defense budgets. I'm talking about the 2% metric, which you've certainly all heard about. And so these issues, for me, are kind of represented in a discussion that has come up in perhaps in the past 2 years, which is a discussion around something that is called the Transatlantic Division of Labor, which has several aspects. I mean, Transatlantic Division of Labor can be institutional, it can be economical and on capabilities, and it can be political. This debate is not very popular in the United States because division of labor implies the divisibility of NATO and implies the divisibility of the alliance because of strategic differences in national policies. So for the Americans and the Canadians, to a certain extent, who are resting on the other side of the Atlantic, any talk about transatlantic division of labor is a little bit scary, to put it nicely. But I want to kind of give you a bigger picture of this transatlantic division of labor talk, because for me it exemplifies a lot of the dynamics that I tried, of the new bargain that I tried to present to you in my short introduction. So very quickly, I mean, when I talk transatlantic division of labor, and it's actually a long word, maybe I shouldn't be saying it too often. What does it mean? So this division of labor between transatlantic partners, quickly in a few words, it would be designed to, on paper, improve the efficiency of the transatlantic partnership on security issues and also help rationalize the cost of shared security responsibilities. That's basically, you know, the overall overarching picture of it. It's work that requires a deeper cooperation at a strategic level and an actionable division of tasks according to national interests and national capabilities. And this in order to serve the general good of the alliance. Talking about this division of labor is mostly relevant because we're in a time of very severe financial constraints, and therefore, you know, the pressure to enhance this division of labor is very, very much acute. You can hear it coming from, you know, several European capitals in a way where you hear the argument that since we cannot be everywhere at the same time, since we can't be in the south, since we can't be in the east, we kind of have to have our own areas of responsibility where we can act more efficiently and where also, most importantly, we can explain to our populations the efforts that we're making militarily and financially to contribute to the security of the alliance. So, I mean, this is extremely important factor. So I'm just going to quickly brush through the institutional level of, you know, what transatlantic division of labor means. It's probably the least exciting, which is why I'm doing it before, because basically I want to tell you a few words about what we would expect, like, of a division of labor between NATO and the EU. And it's fair to say that this labor has not been any sort of successful in the past. For those of you who follow security debates closely, NATO-EU relations are, you know, very, very close to a nightmare, unfortunately, even though it would make entire sense for NATO and the EU to cooperate very closely on security issues. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the Europe is from Venus, the US from Mars type of analogy. There is kind of a, you know, movement at the moment to kind of turn this maxim on its head. And this is where the NATO-EU relations play a strong role. In my mind, there is an absolute necessity to improve and deepen the dialogue that the two institutions have. But as I just said, it has remained a long-standing point of contention because each institution has its own set of competences, has its own set of expertise, and kind of having a dialogue between the two is very difficult. Also because of issues of overlap in membership. Obviously, the EU is not, the US is not a member of the EU. Turkey is a member. Turkey is not a member of the EU, and these small things that kind of stop cooperation. But recently, you've seen a movement, especially coming from the European capitals, with implicit support from the US, to push forward this NATO-EU cooperation. Why so? Because, in a way, the division of labor between the two institutions has kind of informally taken place with the Ukraine crisis unfolding. I mean, NATO's military relevance has, in a way, been reaffirmed with the crisis in Ukraine, with Moscow showing very revanchist policies. And you can argue that the EU has, for one of the first times, achieved a decent level of foreign policy coherence by applying strong sanctions on Russia. And that is one of the first examples of a successful division of labor between NATO and the EU. And I'm happy to hear arguments that it's not the case, more than willing to discuss it. But you hear lots of people kind of put forward this sort of cooperation between the two institutions as being something that is extremely important for the future and for the credibility of the institutions. So there is the argument that investing in a strong NATO, investing in an even stronger EU, is the key to designing a comprehensive transatlantic strategy in which there is an articulation between political, economic, and defense capabilities. Both NATO and the EU can provide efficient frameworks to divide these responsibilities and legitimize the actions of transatlantic partners without harming significantly transatlantic unity. I mean, I want you to also keep in mind this idea of division of labor versus harming transatlantic unity, harming transatlantic deterrence, and the harming transatlantic credibility. I think this is very important. So just on the what's preventing this institutional cooperation from happening. In a way, it requires much more political support in member states. And it requires a greater effort in terms of defense capabilities. It's not only necessary that the defense budgets, the defense capabilities increase, but it also is extremely necessary that the way Europeans spend money becomes more efficient and effective in bringing to the table the type of capabilities that NATO and the EU need to successfully answer the challenges in its east and in its south. The capabilities debate is often very abstract. I mean, the 2% is a metric which is, but like all metrics, very imperfect, but it's the only one that really exists, and it's the only one that really matters to the biggest players in NATO, which is to say the US. And because of that, it has become a constant source of tension. Why so? Because there are only 5 countries who spend more than 2% of their GDP on defense, and I will pay a beer tonight to anyone who tells me who those 5 countries are. Hint: one of them is Greece, very surprisingly. And so anyway, I just wanted to kind of tell you that this 2% metric is very debatable, and that you have countries, even including the Czech Republic actually, I've heard very recently, have made the argument that their GDP is growing so fast that they cannot adjust, they cannot spend enough money to arrive at the 2% level. This is an argument that countries like Germany use very often. This is an argument that also countries like Norway, whose GDP fluctuates depending on the price of oil and gas, also use to justify why they cannot spend 2%. So, just these symbolic examples give you an idea of where this debate about the 2% is. It's more about finding excuses about why we're not doing it, rather than kind of drawing concrete plans and selling to the people why arriving at this metric is very important. And this automatically creates, a certain amount of tensions between the North American part of NATO and its European partners. So basically, look, a renewed effort by European countries to increase quantitatively, qualitatively their defense capabilities is really a priority to avoid further widening the spending gap and the technological gap that exists between the US and the European armies. Why so? Because, I mean, it's a very simple fact. I don't remember the figure exactly, and I should have looked it up, but when the US spends $1 to get a certain amount of equipment, or $100, the Europe needs to spend about 160 euros to get that same amount of equipment. So, you know, when you don't spend the same amount of money to get 1% of a fighter jet, or 1% of a tank, or of an armored vehicle, or whatever. And this, you know, kind of goes to illustrate the efficiency of the European defense market versus the efficiency of the American defense market. And this means that the Europeans have to spend more money to equip themselves. And that also means that they spend less money on the very important part of the defense equipment, which is, say, the research and development of weapons. So, you know, this means that there is a gap when you have an operation between Americans that brings together Americans and Europeans. In Libya, for example, it means you have a technological gap between the partners. So it means that the equipment is not necessarily interoperable. It means that the armies cannot necessarily fight together. It's actually very simple, but it's also very maddening. And the Americans were very maddened in Libya. They realized that, for example, the French army, which was the lead-in coalition partner, did not have simply enough bombs to carry out the bombing missions that they had agreed to do. And there is this wonderful example that at the end, the French fighter jets were taken off with basically just giant blocks of concrete instead of bombs and missiles in their planes. So they were literally dropping slabs of concrete on strategic Libyan positions. So, and this is an example that has stuck very deeply in the mind of the Americans. I mean, the operations have revealed, you know, the European shortfalls, and in a way, not only shortfalls, but also real concerns regarding the European capacities to act single-handedly and in a sustainable manner in its neighborhood. So this explains, you know, the American nervousness, to put it nicely, when the Ukraine crisis came up to the plate. And this also explains the American nervousness when they hear the word Transatlantic Division of Labor, because this would give, you know, a strategic preeminence to European powers in Eastern Europe, in North Africa, and any sort of successful Transatlantic Division of Labor depends very, very deeply on the European ability to significantly increase its defense capabilities. So you don't arrive at a situation like Libya, where the French are dropping blocks of concrete via the Mirage fighter, or the Mirage and the Rafale fighter jets, which are pieces of equipment that cost about 400 million euros to produce individually. So you kind of see, you know, the irony in this. The other important aspect of this Transatlantic Division of Labor debate that I'm talking about is the fact that it will require, for the first time I would submit actually for the first time, it will require concerted action across, or at least first time for the Europeans, to be very precise, will require concerted action across domestic and foreign security policy domains. We've arrived at a moment where, for example, in France, you see very, very little gap between what we do in our domestic policy, what we do in our foreign policy, and vice versa. In a way, you can submit that, you know, the terrorist attacks that took place in France early this year in January are an extension of the fact that France has been fighting in Mali, France has been fighting in Libya against terrorism, and you know, this really has stuck to the mind of European political leaders. And this is why I say that any sort of action that we take right now really requires concerted action, or at least concerted thoughts across domestic and foreign security policy domains. Such as, so I've talked about terrorism, but there are also issues that are important to NATO, hybrid warfare, international crime, that are addressed both at the transatlantic level and at the national level by national police forces. So in this context of division of labor, what does this mean? It means that transatlantic partners should clearly establish their areas of lead responsibility to avoid any sort of duplication. Which means, what cannot be covered by NATO, by the EU, should be covered by national police forces. That also means that there is a real incentive now to develop new forms of security cooperation at national and transatlantic levels. For example, on immigration. I mean, immigration is one of the hottest topics on which people have been discussing how can we develop new forms of transatlantic and at least intra-European cooperation. The other part that I want to give you a few thoughts about is really the role of the United States. And this is maybe the biggest elephant in the room, as a matter of fact, for me. You have a dynamic of the transatlantic relationship in Europe, which is extremely interesting. When I started my job with the German Marshall Fund in early 2012 in Paris, there was lots of concern about the so-called pivot to Asia. People were thinking, well, okay, the Americans are abandoning Asia, the Americans are abandoning Europe. It's a good quid pro quo. The Americans are abandoning Europe, and they will, they will not take care. They will not stay in Europe. They will not have strategic capabilities positioned in Europe. They will not be able to answer European threats. And you arrive at a situation 3 years later where basically the Europeans are comfortable with the fact that the Americans have, strategically retrenched to a certain extent from Europe. But in those 3 years, in between 2012 and now, I mean, the Ukraine crisis has come up. And so there's been a fantastic, kind of liftoff in the mind of the Europeans that they are now ready to do without the Americans to a certain extent. But what the Europeans are claiming, what the Europeans are, really clamoring out for is a clarification of the role of the US. Because, I mean, in the US right now, in between the global strategic environment, which has left Obama and the administration a little bit unfazzled, the real serious budget constraints that exists, this has led to a redefinition of Washington's security priorities. The Obama administration has rooted its foreign policy in the building of strong partnerships and in the sharing of responsibilities, which has directly affected the nature of the transatlantic relationship. And even though, although US security engagement in Europe remains strong, there is always the message coming from Washington that European powers must continuously work to keep the United States interested in investing more in the alliance, not only with capabilities, but also politically. Because you see today that, for example, a country like Hungary, which is in lots of ways the black sheep of the EU. And you've seen Viktor Orban's statements, you've heard what he said. But on the other hand, Hungary in NATO is a perfectly normal player, is a perfectly viable player with the little money that they spend on defense. I mean, they do not oppose any sort of resistance. Because for lots of countries, the presence of the US is, in a way, a fantastic equalizer of differences. So this is why the political engagement of the US in Europe is extremely important in a way to preserve the unity and the credibility of the alliance. And I insist also on credibility because I am by no means a Russia specialist, but I have read enough papers, enough interviews that suggest that the situation in Ukraine is not a confrontation between Europe and Russia. It's in a way a proxy confrontation between Russia and the United States, and that Russia respects American power above all. Russia does not respect European power. So Russia, in a way, respects NATO because the US is engaged militarily in NATO and because the US is engaged politically in the region. And this is a very important part of the argument of the Europeans who say we are going to do our homework on defense spending, but in the meanwhile, we really need continuous US political presence, and we really need the US to continue to put pressure on Russia while we are doing the homework that you are asking us to do. So, but as Jirji said in the introduction, I just came back from Washington, and I had the chance to talk to a few people in the Department of State, in the Department of Defense, experts who are all telling me who are all echoing very strong concerns about the American understanding of Europe. In a way to say that the Americans are not interested in the European problems. They don't visibly see the European problems. What they are interested in is the resurgence of Russia. So in a way, Europe's problem is not Europe. Europe's problem is Russia. And when you talk to the diplomats, the European diplomats in Washington, there is really visible frustration at this American way of seeing things. And I think this is a very interesting fault line, is that in a way, when the Americans, Canadians, and the Europeans talk about threats, they're not talking about the same threats. And that is, for me, extremely damaging in the way we conduct a security cooperation, in the way we conduct this transatlantic relationship. So, and there is also concern on the European side that the Obama administration is on its way out, and we kind of know what to expect and what not to expect. But there is real concern, for example, that if a Republican candidate wins, that the unknown factor is extremely high, whether it be Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio, the front runners. There is very little understanding of the Europeanness of the European problem, and not of the Russianness of the European problem. So there was, a very fairly negative feeling about this, and in my mind, this requires better outreach by the Europeans to explain to the Americans the importance of what is taking place within Europe of 28, not within the global Europe which has crisis in its neighborhood. So this is basically the quick take on the US. On Europe, it's really important that key powers such as France, obviously, Germany, the UK, Poland, really take on an increased share of responsibilities in the security debate. However, that is right now extremely difficult to kind of have a unified position between these major players. And this brings me back to what I was telling you, like thinking of a new European bargain rather than just simply a transatlantic bargain. And why is it difficult to have this level of unity? Because you have the big players that are all going in different directions right now. I mean, arguably you can say that France is a major military player, but is a major military player in its southern neighborhood. So was engaged in Libya, engaged in Mali, engaged in Central African Republic, and basically engaged very strongly in the stability of the Sahel region for counter-terrorist reasons, and also engaged in the fight against the ISIS group. The UK is in a period of strategic lull, to put it very nicely. Since the vote of the House of Commons voting no against the intervention in Syria after the chemical attacks, British foreign policy, defense policy has lost, its visibility, to put it again very kindly, and they have lost their influence to the extent that, when the French defense minister was in Washington last week, his visit to the American Secretary of Defense was, one of the most positive that has ever happened. And was described as, France was described as the the most important strategic partner of the US. That kind of turns on its head this vision of the US-UK relationship as being the structure and relationship of NATO. And with the UK now finally coming out of its election cycle, albeit starting another one on very different issues, there is very little expectations that the UK will be able to take a strong stance on a variety of security and foreign policy issues. Germany is another very interesting example, and you're sitting here in the Czech Republic, and there are lots of discussions that take place about the role of Germany. Why so? Because Germany has historically been a reluctant power. They have a very able army, but in a way, just to give you very quickly, they need parliamentary approval to deploy any sort of troops in a combat theater. So, for example, I mean, the one that is very interesting, that is relevant to the French, is that the Germans did not get authorization to deploy a hospital plane or a medical plane to the Central African Republic when the French asked for support. So they had to deploy the plane to a neighboring country, and the French had to transport the injured from the Central African Republic to a neighboring country where they were able to be treated on that plane. So that kind of shows you, the historical reluctance and the problems that exist in the German system to have a stronger role in foreign policy. And they have now been engaged for the past 2 years in a review process of their foreign policy, in a review process of their security policy, but you still see very little appetite, even on the part of the decision makers, to have a security role that reflects the economic might of the country. And that is, extremely frustrating to lots of the European partners who would like Germany also to be a strong, who would like Germany to carry this European pillar of foreign and security policy. And my favorite example, and I cannot resist to tell you this, and maybe you've seen it, but there was a training, a NATO training a few months ago, where German troops were supposed to take part, and they were supposed to come equipped with automatic weapons. The problem is they didn't have, their automatic weapons were not working. So what they did is that they took a few broomsticks, painted them black, and upholstered the broomsticks. So you literally had German soldiers come into a NATO training with broomsticks on their belt and pretending that the broomsticks were guns. I think this is just, it's funny, but it's also very, very, it has a real impact on the way people view German security policy. And for what is arguably the most important country in Europe, I think that is a little bit problematic. And then on the German border, you have Poland, which has come up in the past few years as the new player in security policy. They've finally reached this year the level of 2% of GDP spending. They're involved in a heavy process of modernization of their armed forces. They have a very proactive security policy, which is mostly informed by the fact that they feel threatened by Russian resurgence at the near border. And they've taken a very strong, even hawkish role in designing NATO policies to the crisis in Ukraine. So, I mean, I just wanted to give you these 4 examples because they're extremely representative of the strategic divisions that exist within Europe. And it also gives you, a clear view of how difficult it is right now to think of this European part of the bargain. And also, I'm also saying this because it's something that Americans, Canadians need to hear, is that these divisions exist. They're not easily bridgeable, but however, I mean, you can argue that the deliverables of the Wales Summit have been fairly successful, and there is a real challenge looking to the Warsaw Summit to understand what sort of deliverables are needed, not only to reassure the Eastern allies, but also to take into account the concerns of the Southern allies. And this is where, for example, the role of Poland is extremely important in setting the agenda of the NATO summit, but also becoming not only an Eastern power or a Northern power, but also becoming a global power, a country that can take into account the considerations of the Southern allies. So, for example, it's a very important variable right now as to whether Poland will have enough bandwidth to listen to the concerns of the Italians, of the Spaniards, of the French, of the Greeks about what is happening in the southern neighborhood of the alliance. And this is just one small item that I really encourage you to follow very closely. All this to say that a strong intra-European leadership is crucial to increase the sense of ownership of the Transatlantic Alliance by European powers. Because the Americans, as I said in my introduction, still own the political dynamics of the alliance, but there is a desire in Washington to kind of let go of this leadership and to transfer lots of the burden, lots of the political burden and the military burden to the Europeans. And this is also important for the Europeans because there's still a little bit of frustration at the fact that the alliance is US-led. So, I mean, there's work to be done on both sides on working on this balance of leadership within the alliance. So I talked about Transatlantic division of labor. I mean, it's, as I said, it's a term that is very popular to discuss, but that is very unpopular to, in a way, discuss the implementation of. But the recent events in Ukraine, the fight against the ISIS group, have really provided a new momentum for transatlantic security cooperation. The strength of NATO and EU strategic coordination is unarguably a vital deterrent to further Russian aggression in Ukraine or elsewhere. Whether via common institutions or frameworks such as NATO, such as the Common Security Defense Policy of the European Union, or at the bilateral level, the United States and Europe have really a new incentive to improve transatlantic strategic cooperation and foster the beginning of a dialogue on the division of labor. This is true, not only when it comes to the discussions about hybrid warfare or even about conventional warfare, but this momentum is also extremely important. The momentum that exists with the crisis in our neighborhoods is also extremely important to improve public diplomacy and the way leaders communicate the importance of defense to their populations in order to obtain the support of the population for increased defense spending and financial investment in security affairs. While the Ukrainian conflict may not provide necessarily a long-term raison d'être for the transatlantic partnership, and even if it doesn't provide this raison d'être, it should still help to build a few structures, mental structures, to create new mental maps within transatlantic partners to share security responsibilities stronger between the United States and Europe, and give a concrete form to this new bargain. And I really think I am a believer in this new transatlantic security bargain because I believe that it is the most adequate way, if it is worked out properly, to provide the proper levels of deterrence and of unity in order to stave the threats that exist in our neighborhoods. And this brings me back to my question at the beginning, which is to say, whether this is going to be a short-term or a long-term threat. And since I'm a think tanker, I will not answer my own question, but I will leave it up to you for the discussion to whether you think this transatlantic division of labor, which I kind of argued to you, whether it's a short-term solution or whether you see it as a long-term solution. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I look forward to the discussion.